The sun set behind the small, white brick New Hope Baptist Church, casting an orange glow over the quiet town of Cypress Falls, Tennessee. It was a typical Sunday evening in a place where people trusted their neighbors and locked their doors only out of habit. The congregation had just finished their service, and Reverend Elijah Carter had, once again, left the community inspired by his fiery sermon about faithfulness and trust. His booming voice and magnetic personality had made him a beloved figure in the town for over a decade. But as the crowd filtered out, Reverend Carter stayed behind, lingering on the altar. He wasn't alone. Sitting on the front pew, legs crossed and fingers tapping the edge of her designer handbag, was Selena Moore, a woman whose presence was both intoxicating and unsettling. Her beauty was undeniable. Long black hair that fell like a waterfall, piercing green eyes, and a smile that could disarm the most cautious soul. But beneath that beauty was a storm. Selena was the preacher's secret. For the past 2 years, she had been Elijah Carter's lover, a fact that would shock the devout members of New Hope Baptist if they ever found out. Selena had met Elijah during a counseling session. She was struggling with grief after losing her mother. At first, he was just a kind ear. Then, as weeks turned to months, the line between counselor and confidant blurred, and eventually it snapped. Their affair began in secrecy, fueled by stolen moments and whispered promises. One such promise was what brought Selena back to the church tonight, sitting in the empty sanctuary. Reverend Carter had sworn to her that he would leave his wife, Miriam, by the end of the year. He had promised a life where they could be together openly, no longer hiding in the shadows. But as the months passed, those promises seemed to evaporate, leaving Selena feeling used and discarded. "I can't do this anymore," Selena said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Selena," Elijah said, his tone pleading, "you know it's complicated. Miriam and we've built a life together. The church—" "Don't you dare talk to me about the church," Selena snapped, standing up. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor as she approached him. "You told me you'd leave her. You told me we'd be together. Now you're saying it's too complicated? Do you think I'm stupid?" Elijah sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "I never meant to hurt you, but my marriage isn't something I can just walk away from." "It's not that simple." Tears welled up in Selena's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of fury. "Then you shouldn't have made promises you couldn't keep," she whispered. The tension in the room was palpable, but before Elijah could respond, the sound of the church door opening interrupted them. Miriam Carter stepped in, carrying a tray of leftover sandwiches from the fellowship hall. Her warm smile faltered when she saw Selena standing so close to her husband. "Am I interrupting something?" Miriam asked, her eyes darting between them. Elijah quickly stepped away from Selena, putting on his practiced preacher's face. "No, of course not," he said. "Selena was just seeking some spiritual guidance." Selena smirked, the bitterness in her expression barely concealed. "Yes, Reverend Carter has been very helpful." Miriam's polite laugh did little to mask her unease, but she said nothing more. She set the tray down and began tidying the altar, humming softly to herself. Selena watched her with a mix of envy and disgust. Miriam was everything Selena wasn't: patient, kind, the perfect preacher's wife. But Selena knew one thing Miriam didn't: her husband was a liar. That night, as Selena drove home, her mind raced. She thought about the countless lies Elijah had told her, the empty promises, and the betrayal. She thought about how easily he had slipped back into his role as the devoted husband, while she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered heart. And as she pulled into her driveway, one thought consumed her. If she couldn't have Elijah Carter, no one would. In the weeks that followed, Selena began to unravel. Friends and co-workers noticed her mood swings, her sudden bursts of anger followed by eerie calmness. She became obsessed, sending Elijah countless text messages and voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. Elijah tried to cut ties, but Selena refused to let go. She showed up at the church uninvited, lingering in the back pew during services, her piercing gaze never leaving him. On the morning of March 12th, everything came to a head. It was a special Sunday for the congregation, a day of renewal and commitment. Families filled the pews, and the choir sang with more energy than usual. Miriam Carter was radiant in her lavender dress, standing beside her husband as they led the congregation in prayer. Everything seemed perfect until Selena walked in. She wasn't wearing her usual designer clothes. The call came just as Detective Grace Morgan was finishing her morning coffee at the Cypress Falls precinct. It was a quiet Monday for the seasoned investigator who had spent the better part of 2 decades unraveling the darkest mysteries in this otherwise sleepy town. Grace was known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense approach, a stark contrast to her small-town surroundings. She had solved cases that had stumped entire teams, earning the grudging respect of her peers and the nickname the Bulldog. When her phone buzzed that morning, Grace answered with her usual calm efficiency. Morgan speaking. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Clyde Harris. We've got a situation at New Hope Baptist. Double homicide. Reverend Carter and his wife, shot on the altar. Grace stiffened, her mind already clicking into gear. A murder at the town's most revered church? This wasn't the sort of thing Cypress Falls was used to. I'll be there in 10. She grabbed her coat and her leather-bound notebook, the one she always carried to every crime scene. As she drove to the church, her thoughts turned to Reverend Carter. She didn't attend services, but even she knew of the charismatic preacher who seemed to have the entire town under his spell. A man like that had to have enemies, but murder? In a church? That was something else entirely. The scene at New Hope Baptist was chaotic. Police cars lined the narrow street, their flashing lights illuminating the growing crowd of curious onlookers. News crews were already setting up their cameras, eager to capitalize on the town's darkest hour. Grace parked her car a few blocks away and walked briskly toward the church, her boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, the sanctuary was a grim tableau of violence. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the altar, where 2 bodies lay in pools of blood. Reverend Elijah Carter was sprawled on his back, his once powerful frame now lifeless. His wife, Miriam, lay a few feet away, her lavender dress stained crimson. The scene was eerily silent, save for the whispers of officers and the hum of the forensic team's equipment. Sheriff Harris met Grace at the entrance, his wide-brimmed hat in hand. He was a large man with a kind face, but today he looked 10 years older. "Glad you're here," he said. "This one's ugly." Grace nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "What do we know?" Harris gestured toward the altar. "Witnesses say the shooter was a woman named Selena Moore. She didn't try to run. In fact, she waited for us to arrive. She's in custody now." Grace raised an eyebrow. "She confessed?" "Didn't have to. Half the congregation saw her pull the trigger." Grace's gaze lingered on the bodies. A crime this public, this brazen, wasn't just about anger. It was about sending a message. She crouched down near Elijah's body, careful not to disturb the scene. His hands were empty, his face frozen in an expression of shock. Miriam's body was turned slightly, as if she had been trying to shield herself. "Any idea why she did it?" Grace asked. Harris sighed. "That's the thing. Word is, Selena Moore wasn't just anyone to the Reverend. People are saying she was his, you know, mistress." Grace glanced up sharply. "And his wife?" "Didn't seem to know," Harris replied. "But we're still piecing it together." Grace made her way to the church office, where Selena was being held temporarily. 2 officers flanked the door, their faces a mix of unease and curiosity. Grace paused outside, taking a moment to compose herself. She had interrogated plenty of suspects in her career, but something about this case felt off. When she stepped inside, Selena was sitting in a metal chair, her hands cuffed in front of her. Despite the circumstances, she looked remarkably calm. Her leather jacket had been removed, revealing a plain black t-shirt. Her hair was slightly disheveled, but her green eyes were as piercing as ever. Grace pulled out a chair and sat across from her, placing her notebook on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace studied Selena, trying to read the emotions behind her carefully controlled exterior. Anger, regret, fear, but all she saw was a cold determination. "You're Selena Moore," Grace began, her tone neutral. Selena nodded. "And you're the detective." "I am," Grace said. She leaned back in her chair. keeping her gaze steady. "You know why you're here." "Of course I do," Selena replied. "I killed them." The bluntness of her confession took Grace by surprise, but she didn't let it show. "Why?" Selena's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Because he lied. He told me he'd leave her. He promised me a life together. And then he went back on his word." Grace tilted her head. "So you shot him? And his wife?" Selena shrugged. Miriam was collateral damage. She was in the way. The matter-of-fact tone in Selena's voice sent a chill down Grace's spine. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated, calculated. But Grace knew there had to be more to the story. The next morning, Detective Grace Morgan sat in her cluttered office, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, and a thick file on Reverend Elijah Carter spread across her desk. The air smelled faintly of stale paper and worn leather. She had spent hours combing through police reports, public records, and whispers from her network of informants, trying to piece together the kind of man Elijah Carter had been outside the pulpit. On the surface, he was untouchable, a beloved preacher, a community leader, and a devoted family man. But Grace knew better than to take public personas at face value. Everyone had secrets. The file confirmed the rumors about Selena Moore. Over the past year, there had been sightings of her and Elijah together, meeting at out-of-town motels, dining in dimly lit restaurants, and even taking late-night drives through the outskirts of Cypress Falls. Grace also found a receipt for a diamond bracelet purchased by Elijah 6 months ago. Expensive, intimate, and never seen on Miriam Carter's wrist. But the most damning piece of evidence came from Elijah's phone records. Over the past few months, Selena's number had appeared hundreds of times, with calls and texts growing less frequent in the weeks leading up to the murders. Grace leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her notebook. Selena's story of feeling abandoned lined up, but was it enough to push her to murder? Or was there something else? Grace's next stop was Selena Moore's apartment. It was a modest, one-bedroom unit on the edge of town, tucked in a rundown complex with peeling paint and overgrown bushes. The landlord, a wiry man in his 50s, let her in with a spare key. The apartment was sparse but clean. A battered leather couch sat in the living room, facing a small TV. The coffee table was cluttered with magazines, an empty wine glass, and a half-burned candle. Grace moved to the bedroom, her eyes scanning every corner. On the nightstand, she found a framed photo of Selena and Elijah, smiling as if they didn't have a care in the world. It looked like it had been taken at a park, the sunlight casting a golden glow around them. Next to the photo was a worn diary. Grace hesitated for a moment before flipping it open. Selena's handwriting was neat and deliberate, the words a raw glimpse into her psyche. July 15th. He says he loves me, but I can't shake the feeling that he's hiding something. Why won't he just leave her? September 2nd. He promised me. He said it was just a matter of time. I can't keep living like this, sneaking around and pretending I don't exist. November 10th. I'm starting to wonder if it's all been a lie. He's pulling away, I can feel it. But he'll regret it if he does. The entries grew darker, more erratic, as the months went on. Selena's heartbreak was palpable, her desperation spilling onto the pages. But something about the diary felt off to Grace. Almost too perfect, as if Selena wanted someone to find it. Back at the station, Grace met with forensic analyst Peter Warren, who had been examining the evidence collected from the crime scene. He was a meticulous man with a knack for uncovering hidden details. "Got anything for me, Peter?" Grace asked, leaning against the doorway of his lab. Peter nodded, motioning for her to come in. "We found a couple of interesting things. First, the gun used in the murders was a Glock 19, registered to Selena Moore. No surprises there." Grace frowned. "Go on." "Second," Peter continued, "the trajectory of the bullets tells us something interesting. Miriam Carter was shot first, then Elijah. Based on the angles, it looks like she might have tried to run, but Selena stepped closer to ensure the kill. It was methodical." Grace crossed her arms. "So much for a crime of passion?" Peter hesitated. "There's one more thing. We tested Selena's hands for gunpowder residue. She tested positive, but the amount was unusually low." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" meaning it's possible she fired the gun, but someone else might have handled it more extensively before or after the murders. Grace's mind raced. Could Selena have been covering for someone? Or had she been manipulated into taking the fall? That evening, Grace decided to dig deeper into Selena's past. A quick search revealed a troubled history. She had grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home, and had a string of petty arrests in her 20s. Shoplifting, public intoxication, disorderly conduct. But what caught Grace's attention was a restraining order filed against Selena 2 years ago by a man named Kevin Turner. According to the report, Kevin had accused Selena of stalking and harassment after their breakup. He claimed she had shown up at his workplace, followed him home, and sent threatening messages. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but Grace couldn't ignore the pattern of obsessive behavior. She tracked down Kevin, who now lived 2 towns over. The following morning, Detective Grace Morgan stood in front of the ornate double doors of New Hope Baptist Church. Despite the media frenzy surrounding the murders, the church still opened its doors to the grieving congregation. The parking lot was full and somber churchgoers filtered inside, murmuring prayers under their breath. Grace wasn't there to pray. She needed answers. Inside, the sanctuary had been scrubbed clean, though the heavy weight of tragedy lingered in the air. The pulpit where Reverend Elijah Carter and his wife Miriam had been murdered was draped in black cloth, adorned with bouquets of white lilies. Grace scanned the room, looking for familiar faces. She spotted Deacon James Lewis, a tall, stoic man in his late 60s, standing near the altar. He had been Elijah's right-hand man for years, and one of the few people with access to the church's inner workings. "Detective Morgan," he greeted, his deep voice steady despite the strain in his eyes. "What brings you here today?" "I need to ask you a few questions, Deacon," Grace said, pulling out her notebook. "About Reverend Carter, his wife, and Selena Moore." James sighed, nodding toward a private room behind the sanctuary. "Let's talk in the back. This isn't a conversation for public ears." Once inside the room, James closed the door and gestured for Grace to sit. He remained standing, hands clasped in front of him like a man bracing for judgment. "Elijah was a good man," James began, his voice heavy. "But he wasn't perfect. None of us are." "Did you know about his relationship with Selena Moore?" Grace asked bluntly. James hesitated, then nodded. "I suspected. He was careful, but not careful enough. I saw them together a few times. Nothing inappropriate, just too familiar. I confronted him about it once." "What did he say?" "He denied it, of course. Said Selena was a troubled woman who needed spiritual guidance, but I could tell there was more to it." James paused, rubbing a hand over his face. "I begged him to end it. I told him it would destroy everything he'd worked for if the truth came out, but he didn't listen." Grace leaned forward. "Do you think Selena killed him out of jealousy? Because he refused to leave his wife?" James shook his head. "I don't know. Selena was intense, but she wasn't the only one upset with Elijah. There were others who felt betrayed by him, people who thought he'd promised them more than he could deliver." Grace's ears perked up. "What do you mean?" "Elijah was ambitious," James said. "He wanted to expand the church, start new programs, reach more people. But to do that, he needed money. He borrowed from the wrong people, made promises he couldn't keep. Some of those people are still waiting to be repaid." Grace's next stop was the home of Diane Harper, a longtime member of the church who had served on the finance committee. Diane was a retired school teacher with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. "I don't see why you're here, Detective," Diane said as she poured Grace a cup of tea. "Elijah's dead. Isn't that punishment enough?" "I'm just trying to understand what happened," Grace replied. "I've heard that the church's finances weren't in great shape. Can you tell me more about that?" Diane snorted, sitting across from Grace. "That's putting it lightly. Elijah had big dreams but no sense. He took out loans to build that new youth center, but when the donations didn't come in, he started cutting corners. Miriam tried to keep him grounded, but he wouldn't listen." "Did he ever ask the congregation for help?" "Oh," he asked, "but people only have so much to give. And when that wasn't enough, he went looking elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" Grace prompted. Diane hesitated, her lips pursing. There were rumors that he got involved with some unsavory characters. Loan sharks, maybe, but I don't know for sure. Elijah kept his dealings private. Grace filed that away. If Elijah was in debt to dangerous people, it opened up an entirely new angle to the case. Back at the station, Grace reviewed the evidence again. Selena's diary painted a picture of a woman scorned, but it didn't explain the methodical nature of the crime. The trajectory analysis from Peter suggested a level of control that didn't match Selena's emotional instability. Then there was the financial angle. If Elijah owed money to dangerous people, could someone else have used Selena as a scapegoat? Grace decided to follow the money. She obtained a warrant to access the church's financial records, hoping to find a paper trail that would lead to the truth. What she found was worse than she expected. The church's accounts were a mess. There were large withdrawals with no clear explanation, payments to unknown entities, and discrepancies that suggested someone had been cooking the books. One name kept appearing in the records: Marcus Reed. Marcus was a local businessman with a reputation for shady dealings. Detective Grace Morgan's mind raced as she drove back to the precinct. The investigation had become a web of secrets: Selena's obsession, Elijah's financial troubles, and the involvement of Marcus Reed. Each piece seemed connected, but the puzzle was far from solved. Back at her desk, Grace sorted through new evidence and statements from interviews. One name stood out repeatedly in the notes: Miriam Carter. The late pastor's wife had been described as a pillar of strength, but whispers among the congregation suggested she might have known more about Elijah's indiscretions and his financial troubles than she let on. Grace decided it was time to dig deeper into Miriam's life. The next morning, Grace paid a visit to the Carter's home. The modest brick house stood in stark contrast to the grand church Elijah had built. Miriam's sister, Caroline Owens, had been staying at the house since the murders and was packing boxes when Grace arrived. Caroline, a reserved woman in her 50s, looked up from the pile of belongings. "Detective Morgan, I wasn't expecting you." "I appreciate your time, Caroline," Grace said gently. "I need to ask some questions about Miriam. Did she ever confide in you about problems in her marriage?" Caroline sighed, sitting on the edge of the couch. Miriam was proud. She didn't like airing her dirty laundry, but I knew things weren't perfect between her and Elijah. She tried to be the ideal preacher's wife, but deep down she was hurt by his indiscretions. Did she know about Selena more? Caroline hesitated, her hands gripping the armrest. Yes, she found out a few months ago. Elijah swore it was over, and Miriam wanted to believe him, but she was devastated. She blamed herself for not being enough for him. Grace nodded, jotting down notes. Did Miriam ever talk about leaving him or taking any drastic actions? Caroline's eyes widened. Miriam was angry, but she wasn't a violent person. She wanted to save their marriage, not destroy it. If you're suggesting she had anything to do with this, I'm not suggesting anything, Grace assured her. I just need to explore every possibility. As Grace left the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Miriam's story. Later that day, Grace received the results of a forensic analysis on Selena's gun. The weapon had been recovered from her car, and while her fingerprints were on it, so were traces of another person's DNA. It wasn't conclusive enough to identify the individual, but it opened up the possibility that Selena wasn't acting alone. Grace decided to question Selena again. In the sterile confines of the interrogation room, Selena looked more composed than before, though her eyes were still bloodshot from crying. I didn't kill them, Selena said before Grace could ask a question. I swear I didn't. Then explain how your gun ended up at the scene, Grace said, her tone sharp but not unkind. Selena shook her head. I don't know. I kept that gun in my apartment for protection. Someone must have taken it. Who? Selena hesitated, her brow furrowed. I don't know. I didn't even know they were dead until you arrested me. I loved Elijah. I would never hurt him. Grace leaned forward. Selena, if you're lying to me, I'll find out. But if someone else was involved, someone who manipulated you or used you as a scapegoat, now's the time to tell me. Tears welled in Selena's eyes. He promised me he'd leave her. He said we'd be together. But then he started pulling away. I thought it was just stress from the church, but now I think maybe he was afraid of someone. He was so distracted those last few weeks. Afraid of who? I don't know, Selena whispered. But there was a man who came to see him a few times. I saw them arguing outside the church. Grace's heart raced. Do you remember what he looked like? Tall, dark skin, muscular build. I think his name was Andre. With this new lead, Grace returned to the precinct and ran a search for anyone named Andre connected to Elijah Carter or the church. The name Andre Walker popped up. He was a former member of the congregation who had left under suspicious circumstances a year earlier. Andre had a criminal record for assault and had worked briefly as a security contractor for the church before being let go. Witness statements from that time suggested he had a temper and had clashed with Elijah over unpaid wages. Grace tracked Andre to a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town. When she knocked on the door, a burly man in his late 30s answered, his expression wary. "What do you want?" he asked. "Detective Grace Morgan," she said, holding up her badge. "I have some questions about Elijah Carter." Andre's face darkened. "I don't know anything about that. You were seen arguing with him shortly before his death," Grace said, "and your name keeps coming up in my investigation. Care to explain?" Andre glared at her but didn't shut the door. "Yeah, I argued with him. The man owed me money." Detective Grace Morgan returned to her desk, her mind racing with the discovery of the large withdrawal from the church's account to Miriam Carter's name. The question burned in her mind. What was Miriam planning to do with the money? As Grace dove deeper into the financial records, she noticed irregularities in the church's accounts dating back nearly a year. Money was being funneled out in small, incremental amounts to a shell company called Faith Enterprises, which was registered under Marcus Reed, the church treasurer. Grace's pulse quickened. Marcus had been in charge of the church's finances for years, a trusted figure in the congregation, but his name kept surfacing in connection with Elijah's secrets. Grace decided it was time to pay him a visit. Marcus Reed lived in a luxurious home in the suburbs, a stark contrast to the humble lives of most of the congregation. Grace knocked on the heavy oak door, and Marcus opened it, his demeanor guarded. "Detective Morgan," he said with a tight smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Grace stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "I need to talk to you about the church's finances." Marcus's smile faltered. "What about them?" Grace pulled out copies of the financial records. "Care to explain why funds were being funneled into a shell company under your name?" Marcus's face paled, and he took a step back. I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Grace said sharply. "You've been embezzling money from the church, haven't you? Did Elijah find out? Is that why you had him killed?" Marcus's eyes widened in panic. "No, I didn't kill him. Yes, I moved some money around, but Elijah knew about it. He approved it." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Why would Elijah approve you stealing from the church?" Marcus hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. "It wasn't stealing. It was a loan. Elijah was in deep with some dangerous people. He needed cash fast, and the church's accounts were the easiest way to get it. I helped him cover it up." "Dangerous people like Andre Walker?" Grace pressed. Marcus nodded reluctantly. "Andre loaned Elijah money to cover his gambling debts. When Elijah couldn't pay it back, Andre started threatening him. That's when Elijah came to me." Grace stared at him, piecing together the new information. "So you funneled money to Andre to keep him quiet. But if the debts were settled, why would Andre still want Elijah dead?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe the payments weren't enough. Or maybe Andre found out Elijah was planning to go to the police." Grace left Marcus's house with more questions than answers. The revelation about Elijah's gambling debts added another layer to the case, but it didn't explain why Miriam had withdrawn such a large sum of money. She decided to follow up with Andre Walker. This time, she wasn't going to let him dodge her questions. Andre's apartment was dark when Grace arrived. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Suspicious, she tried the handle. It was unlocked. Drawing her gun, she stepped inside. The apartment was a mess. Papers and trash were strewn across the floor, and the air smelled of stale beer. In the corner of the living room, Grace spotted a duffel bag filled with cash. "Detective Morgan," a voice said behind her. Grace spun around to see Andre standing in the doorway, his expression cold. "Breaking and entering, huh?" he said, stepping inside. That's a bold move. I could say the same about embezzlement and murder, Grace shot back. Andre laughed bitterly. Murder? I didn't kill anyone. Then why is there a bag of cash in your apartment that matches the amount withdrawn from the church's account? Andre's smirk faded. Miriam gave me that money, he admitted. Why would she do that? She wanted me to scare Selena off, Andre said. She didn't want to get her hands dirty, so she paid me to take care of Elijah's little girlfriend. But I never got the chance. Why not? Andre's jaw tightened. Because someone beat me to it. By the time I found out Selena was at the church, the deed was already done. Grace studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. If you're lying to me, Andre, I'll make sure you rot in prison. I'm not lying, Andre said. Miriam wanted Selena out of the picture, but she never wanted Elijah dead. She loved him, no matter how much he hurt her. Back at the precinct, Grace reviewed everything she learned. Miriam had paid Andre to scare off Selena, but someone else had taken matters into their own hands. The DNA on the gun still hadn't been matched, but Grace had a gut feeling that the answers lay in the church. The next morning, Grace returned to the church and spoke with the janitor, an elderly man named Harold. Harold, I need to know if anyone came to the church after hours the night before the murders, Grace said. Harold scratched his head. I remember seeing someone, a woman. She was sitting in the pews crying. Did you recognize her? He nodded. Detective Grace Morgan knew she was closing in on the truth, but she also knew the final piece of the puzzle would require more than just evidence. It would take strategy. Miriam Carter had been at the church the night before the murders, and Andre Walker had implicated her in a scheme to eliminate Selena. Yet Miriam was dead, leaving Grace with one suspect whose connection to the crime was becoming harder to ignore. Marcus Reed. It was time to push Marcus to his breaking point. Grace sat across from Marcus in the dimly lit interrogation room. The walls felt closer than usual, a deliberate design to make the suspect uncomfortable. Marcus shifted in his chair, avoiding her gaze. You've been cooperative so far, Grace began, sliding a photo of the crime scene across the table. But I think you're still holding back. Marcus glanced at the photo and winced. I told you everything I know. Let's recap then, Grace said, her tone sharp. You helped Elijah embezzle church funds to pay off gambling debts. You knew about Miriam Carter's involvement with him and her jealousy toward Selena. You even admitted Elijah was planning to go to the police about Andre Walker. So why don't you tell me what really happened that night? Marcus's hands trembled as he clasped them on the table. I wasn't there, detective. I swear. Grace leaned forward. But you were involved, weren't you? The gun used in the shooting had its serial number scratched off, a classic sign of premeditation. And we found your fingerprints on a storage box in the church basement that held ammunition. Care to explain that? Marcus's eyes widened. I didn't. You did, Grace interrupted. You were in over your head with Elijah. Maybe you were afraid he'd expose the embezzlement and drag you down with him. Maybe you saw his relationship with Selena as a liability, or maybe Miriam convinced you to do something drastic. Marcus broke. Miriam was losing it, okay? She couldn't stand the thought of Elijah staying with his wife. She said he promised to leave Selena, to make a fresh start with her, but he lied. She was angry, furious. Grace kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced. So what did she do? She called me the night before, Marcus admitted. She said she needed my help to end it all. I thought she was just being dramatic, but then she mentioned the gun. She said she'd already bought it and that she couldn't trust Elijah anymore. Did you help her get the gun? Grace asked. Marcus hesitated. No, but I knew she had one. She asked me to meet her at the church the next morning. She said it was important. Grace's team corroborated Marcus's story with security footage from a gas station near the church. Miriam had been spotted the night before the murders, purchasing a box of ammunition. It seemed clear that Miriam's rage and heartbreak had driven her to confront Elijah. But something still didn't add up. If Miriam had planned to kill Elijah and Selena, why had Marcus's fingerprints been found on the ammunition box? Grace suspected Marcus hadn't told her the whole truth. Hours later, Grace got the break she'd been waiting for. The DNA from the gun came back, a match for Marcus Reed. She confronted him again, this time armed with undeniable evidence. Your DNA was on the murder weapon, Marcus, Grace said, tossing the lab report onto the table. You didn't just know about Miriam's plan, you were part of it. Marcus broke into a sweat. I didn't kill anyone, I swear. Miriam showed up at the church that morning, just like she said she would. She was furious. She had the gun in her bag. I tried to talk her down. What happened next? Grace demanded. She stormed into the sanctuary yelling at Elijah and Selena, Marcus said, his voice trembling. I stayed in the back, hoping she'd calm down. But then I heard gunshots. And you didn't call the police? Grace pressed. I panicked, Marcus cried. I ran into the sanctuary and saw Miriam standing over their bodies, the gun in her hand. She looked at me and said, I did this for us. Then she turned the gun on herself. Grace frowned. If that's true, why did you touch the gun? Marcus buried his face in his hands. I didn't mean to. After she shot herself, I grabbed the gun. I don't even know why. I was in shock. Then I dropped it and ran. I swear that's all I did. Grace reviewed the details of Marcus's confession. It matched the physical evidence, the trajectory of the bullets, the fingerprints on the gun, and the DNA on the trigger. Marcus's story also explained why Miriam's fingerprints were smudged. He had handled the weapon after her death. While Marcus's actions were reckless and incriminating, the evidence pointed to Miriam as the primary perpetrator. Consumed by jealousy and betrayal, she had killed the man she loved, the woman she envied, and ultimately herself. Grace stood before the press a week later, detailing the conclusion of the case.